Hi, and welcome to The Existential Coach. On this episode, I want to talk about love. And in part, I've been reading Mari Ruti's book, The Summons of Love. And some of the other books that I've been looking at are Penis Envy and Other Bad Feelings, The Singularity of Being, Lacan, and The Immortal Within, and Reinventing the Soul, Posthumanist Theory, and Psychic Life. And then finally, a book I'm looking forward to as well is Between Levinas and Lacan, Self-Other Ethics. But today I want to talk about love, and I want to talk about the book, The Summons of Love, or more generally talk about love and then draw upon some of the things that are talked about just in the opening pages of this book. But first, why am I talking about love? There is a lot of pressure and weight on the experience of love that can be articulated in a variety of different ways. But generally speaking, I want to look at love as this kind of hope. Now, whatever that means, that can be articulated and understood in a variety of different ways. And of course, that can be understood within social and cultural contexts. But generally speaking, if one is to think about love, and you are to think about love, what does that mean to you? Does it mean safety? Does it mean being heard? Does it mean excitement? Does it mean passion? Does it mean longevity? Well, there's another side to love. And if we shift away from the kind of love that can be more focused on the individual and what they're supposed to get out of the relationship, in other words, their best self or their best version of themselves and the goals and aspirations that come with them as this kind of project of growth that they will then summit by coming to this realization that love is something that is true and that they can have the love they want, the love they deserve, the love they need, and so on. And I think that's kind of like talking about half the keys on the piano. And whether we just play the black keys on the piano or we just play the white keys, we're not actually playing the whole piano. And similarly here, if we're looking at love as being this positive expression that we can show to the world, that we can actualize in all of these positive ways, or what we see as being positive, and we understand as being demonstrated through these positive paths, these positive ways, these positive whatever they are, then we're turning away from the unknown or the uncertain aspect of love. And if we think about the moments of falling in love, we think about the falling part of falling in love. There is built into that the notion that you are falling. And there was this line, I think it was in a Schoenberg book, I'm not even sure why, but if I remember correctly, he's referring to this phenomenon of falling forward. And I always like this idea. You see children do it when they walk. They're not really walking, they're falling and immediately catching themselves. Particularly when they're really young, you see them like their head is leaning over, creating the momentum, and they're just trying to run enough to not have themselves land face first on the floor. They are falling forward, and they are being caught by themselves, if they're successful, in that experience. And I've often thought that this is actually a good visual to what love is. There is this momentum, this hope, this aspiration, this feeling that you want to move. You want to do something. And I think this is what can motivate us to think about, going on dates or going on dating sites or to in whatever get engaged in trying to get a new start, or maybe we've ended a relationship, or we decided we're at a point in our life where now we want to engage in a relationship in some way. So we say, I'm going to move forward. I'm going to move on. I'm going to move in this way that sort of expresses the development and unfolding of my life, and that I can see myself existing in time, almost like the book is being written and I can now participate with the pen touching the page, with the keys being struck. And I can decide that in moving forward, I will make something of my life. I will create this experience through love. This is falling forward. Of course, what we're then faced with is disappointment. And what I'm arguing here, and what comes up in the summons of love, is this is love, too. That being challenged and pushed into the unknown, being awakened to or awoken to the experience of love, these are aspects of love. And that if we can allow ourselves to exist in love in a way that includes this uncertainty, that includes this seemingly paradoxical dynamic, which means we're going to be exposed to perhaps not our best self, perhaps not the best version of ourselves. And the question becomes, what is being created? And what's so wonderful in this book is this idea, at least for me, is you start to get a picture of what a relationship is, as opposed to what a singular idea of what love is. So, a person can say, I want to fall in love with somebody. These are, you go on a dating site, they look like CVs, right? I like golfing, I like axe throwing, I like reading books, I like drinking wine, I like whatever it is. And they're almost, in a sad way, perhaps kind of comedic, right? There'd be somebody looking really sexy saying, I want authenticity, because there's all of these contradictions. And I don't, maybe sad isn't the right word, but there's these contradictions because there are these contradictions. So let me just take one example. If you see somebody's profile that's really showing you what seems by all general metrics to be a pretty superficial photo, and then they say they want authenticity, it's actually a wonderful illustration of the paradox of love. That we exist in some way, or try to exist in some way, superficially. We try and present ourselves as being really amazing, really sexy, really fun, really dynamic, really happy, really up, all of these different things. And so we want to present that side. Yet there's a part of us that realizes, but we're not always going to be up. We're not always going to be the life of the party. We're not always going to be that exciting. I'm 50. So if you think about dating at 50, you've been through stuff. You already kind of know the jig is up. You kind of know that the suspended belief about a relationship and the one and these kinds of things, those are myths. And sure, you may still aspire to them, and you still may be looking for the one authentic, one experience, whatever that means. But even so, there is this realization that you've gone through heartbreak. You've gone through the loss of the one. You've gone through the illusion. And what may have held a relationship together in the past, what may have held together your understanding of yourself in the past, was this notion that I am constructed within this notion, this idea of love. And this is why I love and Rudy's book so much, is by drawing upon this other aspect of love, the uncertainty, that it draws you towards uncertainty in a way that you can call it unconscious or whatever you want to call it, but fundamentally, it's drawing you towards a kind of destruction of this one-dimensional aspect of our lives. So a real basic example of this is, if we look at ourselves and we say, I'm 25 years old and I've got my sexy photo, well, will I be this same sexy person at 50? Will I be the same sexy person at 75? And some people might say, of course, you can be sexy and it's how you see yourself and, it's all in the eye of the beholder, all this kind of stuff. Sure. But I mean, in a pretty pragmatic, practical way, if we're presenting ourselves as looking a certain way, that is the most fleeting aspect of our being. It raises this question about what can love be if we are trying to show or in some way present an illusion that is the least stable of our experience. And this is where we get into this paradox. And this is what I think is really interesting. If we think about how is it that we understand ourselves and how is it that we one way of looking at this is, in one of the chapters is Hall of Mirrors. And, in that, she writes, I'm just jumping in, we can usually over time find a way to translate even the most devastating of love's blows into personal meaning. And here she's talking about this notion that if we are to explore the break of love, the loss of love, we can actually find meaning. Earlier she writes, my sense is that there is very little about love that is intended to simplify our lives. And if we think about love as this idea that it is going to simplify our lives, we're going to find the one, we're going to ride off into the sunset, we're going to live happily ever after, it actually raises questions about what is that love? And at the beginning when I was talking about what are you imagining with love, what do you envision as being wholesome, as being love, as being safety, as being security, all these kinds of things. Does that challenge you? Does the love that we're talking about here, is this fantasy challenge you, or does it allow you to not be challenged? So she writes, rather, as I have already begun to suggest, its mission is to generate existential turmoil and thoughtfulness so as to prompt us to evolve into more refined, fascinating, and multi-dimensional creatures. Its main task, love, is to induce growth even when the process required for this growth makes us terrified or uncomfortable. Even when it makes us terrified or uncomfortable, because existential growth happens as much through the unexpected obstacles and breakdowns of love. And I want to jump way further in the book, but I think just to add to this idea, she's talking now about the idea of being in a relationship. So under these conditions, being in a relationship, our best course of action may be to concede that when two individuals come together in a romantic alliance, they are more or less guaranteed to arouse each other's deep-seated unconscious patterns. And the more intimate the relationship, the more likely this is to happen. So, if we think about this for a moment, he started off with this idea of what is love, and it was this kind of oceanic, kind of ideal escape. It's what you want, it's your best self, it's something you deserve, it's all these kinds of things. It's really a big wish. And then we entered into a relationship with somebody, and we started to find that the wish we had was not necessarily being actualized or satisfied in the way that we had wanted. And so here we started to shift a little bit in terms of how we understood love. So now I want to jump to a book by Philip Ringstrom called A Relational Psychoanalytic Approach to Couples Psychotherapy. And he has this wonderful phrase for couples. He says, where is it here? Okay, yeah, page 41. So the partners are not simply discovering something about their partner. They are each co-constructing the other's reaction. In essence, they are unconsciously scripting one another as to who they are in any given scenario. Ironically, there really is no alternative to this happening. In other words, this is an inescapable process. Returning to the text, in fact, to work with and this is the key line, hopes and dreads each has brought to the relationship, each partner will inadvertently and unwillingly lend themselves to enacting familiar old self and other configurations. And that relates back to the line I read, the Rudy line from her book. So I'm going to come back to Ringstrom in a second, but so now we started off with this idea of love as this oceanic kind of experience. We've entered into a relationship with somebody that's created a kind of rift. We want to get out of the relationship because we want to get back to the oceanic oneness. However, we lose the connection with the person. We isolate ourselves. We alienate ourselves. We, in whatever way, remove ourselves from the pain, from the dread that we want to experience because we want to return to the hope. And as Ringstrom talks about this idea of hopes and dreads. So there's I want to stay focused on hopes and dreads, and he has two ways of kind of discussing that. And this will, I think, be helpful in terms of understanding how these two dynamics interweave. So the first one is, and I'll explain them, but I'll just read them first. But the first one is self-object experiences, and the next one is repetitive transference experiences. So returning to his text, this is on 42. By self-object experiences, of course, the authors are referring to, he's drawing on an example earlier, different versions of attuned responsiveness to key affect, emotional states, throughout all phases of life. So what we're talking about is emotional connection here, right? The hope part. If you want to think about it, just the key, this is the hope part. The self-object experience is the hope part. Conversely, repetitive transference experiences pertain to fears and dreads of a repetition of self-object failures, i.e., dread is the loss of hope. So if we started off in that oceanic oneness experience, and we're really happy and we're really excited and we're really in love, we look across the room, we see the person, they're so wonderful, and we walk over and we say something and they open up their mouth and we just feel dread. It's like they sound like a disaster. It's just not attractive. It just feels awful. What was all that we saw when we looked at each other? It was so amazing, but when we talked, it was a fiasco. This is the contrast we're talking. So now, keeping in mind the self-object experience, the hopes, and then the other side, the repetitive transference experience, which pertains to dread. And we go back to this idea of pattern I'm drawing upon Ringstrom and Ruti as well. What we find is we've learned the loss of love. We've felt this loss of love. And we have come to understand love within this dynamic, this break, this rupture. And so the pattern of brokenness, of interruptedness, of loss, of whatever word you want to use, has been experienced. And if we are not aware of that, in other words, if we turn away from it, if we try and pretend that it was just an anomaly, that it's not us, it's them, then we don't acknowledge that the dread we experience is about our own understanding of this painful, agonizing loss. And if we can begin to face this loss within ourselves, acknowledging it, by face I mean literally face, to see it. I'm not saying fix it, I'm not saying address it, I'm not saying there's 7 steps to happiness, I'm not saying any of that stuff. But what I am saying is if we can acknowledge it, if we can begin to experience it like we might reading a poem that we don't understand, that we struggle through the words, yet there's something to it. It's as if behind the way the author has constructed the words and the lines, there's something more. There's something we could say that is sublime. And this goes back to something that Ruti points out, the idea that a mountain can be sublime, for example. So love, in this sense, in the struggle of love, can be a truly profound and truly sublime experience. In order for it to be sublime, it has the tumultuousness of light and dark. And almost like a Turner painting where you imagine, especially some of his later works, you can see that there's this energy in his visuals and his paintings that give you a sense of the energy of, for example, a sailboat or a sailing ship on an ocean in a storm. And the power that comes from that is the power that is a part of the love equation that gets lost when we look at the two-dimensional or pornographic aspect of love, which is ironic for me to say the pornographic aspect of love. But let's be clear, in a way, it's an attempt to access love without having the fall. And Zizek and others have made this point that we want love, but we don't want the fall. We want the experience without the sublime darkness, richness, power, force, dread that comes with that. And so if we think for a moment about the experience of love as oneness, like we started, and we moved into this question of, we get into a relationship and we start to experience dread. We look at the person, we're like, who are you? What are you doing? And then we return back to this idea of these two forms of understanding our experience. And so the self-object experience, hope, and the repetitive transference experience, fear, which is the loss of hope. And we think, what's going on with us when we meet somebody, we have a relationship, we're feeling really good, and then all of a sudden it's like the gear shifts and we feel this loss. And this is where I want to spend the rest of the podcast kind of focusing in on. Because when I've talked to people, and I've experienced this myself, there can be this sense of, oh, this is really wonderful. And then we maybe start to see the imperfections. We start to see how it's not practical. We start to see logistical issues. Maybe there's people make different amounts of money, or if they live in different areas. All of these different factors start to be projected onto the relationship as evidence that the relationship can't work. Asking ourselves, is that a pattern? Do we tend to see somebody and be really excited and then start to see the negative? Or let's take another example. We're in a relationship with somebody. It's a long-standing relationship, and it's good, but maybe we don't feel like there's this spark. We're wondering. So we start looking and we start seeing other people as what? What are they? What are these other people? As a friend of mine once said, and I thought this is a great comment, he said, the thing is, with the people you don't know, they don't know your lies. They don't know all of the things that you tried to conceal. They don't know your bumps. They don't know your bruises. They don't know any of that stuff. And so when you fantasize about them, you get to be two-dimensional. You get to, in that sense, be pornographic. You get to be love without the fall. You get to be love without it being sublime love. And there is something that is appealing in a very narcissistic way, because you get everything you want without you exposing any of your vulnerabilities, without you exposing any of your uncertainty, and without you becoming lost to the unknown experience of love with someone else. And so if we think about just this theme of hope and dread, and we ask ourselves, how can hope and dread exist in a relationship? How can they coexist? Well, something to consider is a relationship is its own being, its own expression, its own creation. And so, is there the possibility that we can find out something about who we are through the resistance and tumultuousness that we may experience in a relationship? And in so doing, can we find something out about ourselves that allows us to merge authentically with darker experiences, confusing experiences, traumatic experiences, and in so doing, heal? The paradox of love is that through connection, it's not that we become whole, it's that we come home. Not in a romantic way, but in the sense that we actually engage dimensions of ourselves that outside of the relationship we may project onto other people, or inside the relationship we may project onto other people. And I say this, remember too, is I'm single, so I'm not like I'm talking about this from a perspective of this long-term relationship I'm in, or any relationship I'm in. So I'm talking about this in an abstract sense, and I point this out because it could be easy to think, oh, this is about being in a relationship with somebody else. This is about love, and even though I've talked about it in terms of romantic love, now, as the last part of this episode, let's step out of that narrow way of thinking about things and now think about love beyond the relationship. So I'm asking myself, how can I open myself up to relationships and interpersonal dynamics that are unnerving, that I do feel vulnerable in, that I do feel confused in? How can I step into this uncertainty? How can I feel lost and explore what love is within the context of, as paradoxical as that is to say, within the context of being confused? And there's a kind of endurance that is required for this kind of love. And so when we meet people or talk to people, we begin to see perhaps that the kind of love that they may be looking for is a love that avoids these more contradictory, messy dynamics. And as a result, the kind of love that they're looking for is not love so much as it is the specter of love. It's the love where we talk about summiting the mountain. We go to Mountain Equip Co-op, we buy some stuff, we feel really good about it, we have a latte, we do everything in the planning stage, but we don't actually do it. We don't actually challenge ourselves to experience love as the fall, rather than love as the experience of this oceanic oneness where I can be free of all of the feelings that I have that are overwhelming, that are frustrating, that are whatever they are. And so I think for me, what stood out is, and certainly in the book, The Summons of Love, is how we can look at the falling, the complexity, the uncertainty of love in so many different ways. And I'll just give one more kind of example here. Our narcissistic ideals, as well as our yearning to be rescued from our lack. Lack here is it's like a void, it's nothingness, emptiness. So rescued from our lack, operate on unconscious levels that can lend an astonishing specificity to our desire. We may have all sorts of conscious designs about the kind of lover we should be looking for, the kind of life we should aspire to create, and the kind of relationship we should aim to have. Yet we frequently discard these designs for the sake of some tiny detail that piques our interest in the appearance or demeanor of a complete stranger. So I'll leave it there, but to me that idea of being drawn out of ourselves speaks to the way in which we're drawn towards the fall. We're drawn towards something that wants us to go beyond that oceanic oneness, that singular comfort, that fantasy. It asks us to suspend our reason, and it asks us to have a kind of blind faith, or faith, and to take that leap and to see if we can, in some way, rise to this summit of love, that we can in some way engage the hope and the dread, that we can in some way find within ourselves the voice and feeling of love that is not limited to or restricted to a singular idea that we cannot know. So this has been my kind of fumbling around love, and I think in part because some of the earlier podcasts the past couple of weeks, I wanted to change the tone a bit. And I've been thinking about, through a lot of the kind of BS stuff I'm going through, is how can I find love? Because I don't want my life to be restricted to the politics and the bullshit. So I want to be able to take another step. And to me, it means stepping into love. So as always, you can find me at journalconnor.com. Until next time, bye for now.